Good evening. For those of you here in person at the CSE and watching from home on the live stream, thank you for being present with us on our Drexel Dialogue. One technical issue, we had some problems with our projector, so I'm afraid those of you watching from home will not be able to see the slides that are being used, but we are recording this event as well, and so we will ensure that the edited version includes the slides, as that will be created soon. In 1972, the World Synod of Bishops wrote, "Action on behalf of justice and participation in the transformation of the world fully appeared to us as a constitutive dimension of the preaching of the gospel, or, in other words, of the Church's mission for the redemption of the human race and its liberation from every oppressive situation." Working for justice is our duty as Catholic Christians. It is not a medal to be worn as something extra, but a part of the very fabric of our clothing. It is essential to our faith. At the CSC, we have created Drexel Dialogues as opportunities to facilitate and spark conversation on various aspects of Catholic social teaching and social justice, to remind ourselves of this dimension of our faith. We do hope this is a dialogue, so take good notes and bring good questions. We hope that you just don't learn something tonight, which of course that you will, but are moved to action. In 1984, the Black bishops of the United States wrote a document, "What We Have Seen and Heard." They wrote, "The Catholic Church is not a white church, nor a Euro-American church. It is essentially universal and hence Catholic. The Black presence within the American Catholic Church is a precious witness to this universal character of Catholicism." To my mind, this is the essence of Black Catholic History Month, to remind the Church to remember this universal character, both in the joys and struggles of Black Catholics. If anything, these past 18 months have been a stark reminder the Church in the United States still struggles to hear the witness of those calling for justice. The conversation tonight is part of this struggle, this history, and how St. Louis Black Catholics were at the forefront of the civil rights movement, speaking truth to power, voices calling the Church to be who she must be. I'd now like to invite Elena Mickles, one of our student leaders, to introduce our speaker.
Winnie Sullivan is a writer, an editor, and the director and founder of Penultimate Press, a non-profit publishing company. Publishing is a second career for Miss Sullivan, whose initial training was in the field of psychology. She has earned bachelor's and master's degrees in that discipline and pursued doctoral studies in the Policy Analysis and Public Administration program at St. Louis University. A native Chicagoan, Miss Sullivan now resides in St. Louis, where she attends St. Francis Xavier College Church, serves on the Pastoral Council, and is active in the parish's anti-racism efforts. Currently, she is completing a biography of the life of Sister Mary Antona Ebo, FSM. Please join me as we welcome Winnie Sullivan.
Well, good evening. Thank you, Michael and Elena, for that introduction and for your invitation to join you this evening. I'm Winnie Sullivan, and I'd like to thank you for coming to hear the presentation about the history of Black Catholics in St. Louis. It seems especially fitting that this presentation would be offered as one of the Drexel Dialogues. Mother Catherine Drexel, as you know, was an heiress who entered a religious community and eventually founded the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament. She used her fortune to found schools for Native Americans and for African Americans, one of which is Xavier University in New Orleans, the current home of the Institute of Black Catholic Studies. She was canonized in October of 2000 by Pope John Paul II. And as we journey through the local history of Black Catholics in St. Louis, we're going to see the contributions that Mother Catherine Drexel made right here in St. Louis. So before we begin, I'd like to provide a little bit of structure, a little information about how the presentation will be structured. We'll begin by looking back at this fascinating history of Black Catholics in St. Louis. And after that, we've reserved a little time for questions, for comments, and for discussion. I'd like to preface the presentation by saying that I am not a native St. Louisan, and so I cannot claim the lived experience of growing up Black and Catholic in St. Louis. And it's because of my work on a biography of Sister Mary Antona Ebo, a Franciscan Sister of Mary, a civil rights icon and a Sister of Selma, that I've been immersed in the history of Catholicism in St. Louis, and specifically the history of Black Catholics here. It is an amazing story of determination, resilience, and incredibly strong faith. And it's one that I'm happy to share with you this evening. So I had the opportunity to offer a similar presentation on a couple of prior occasions during Black Catholic History Month. And I learned as people would come up and talk with me after their presentation that some of what you're going to hear is both new and also startling. Attendees at those earlier presentations said they'd never heard anything like it. And many were astonished to hear the length and the depth of the history of Black Catholics in St. Louis. And they were stunned to learn the degree of racial separation and discrimination that had occurred within our church. That experience impressed upon me the need to share this history, and so I'm glad to have that chance this evening. One last point, I would say that while there are elements regarding the history of Black Catholics in St. Louis that are particular to this area, there are also many similarities to other cities which grew to have sizable Black Catholic populations. For example, in the development of national and ethnic parishes within dioceses and archdioceses, the discrimination that Black Catholics experienced from fellow Catholics, there are those similarities. And then the establishment of designated African American parishes, such as St. Augustine in Washington, D.C., St. Augustine in New Orleans, St. Monica's in Chicago, which was founded by Father Augustus Tolton. So we'll look at slide 1 now that is before you. And that picture probably dates from the 1940s. It's a first communicants at St. Elizabeth of Hungary Catholic Church, which became the designated African American parish in the St. Louis Archdiocese. And we're going to be talking a lot more about that parish, which was for years the center of Black Catholic life in St. Louis. Next slide, please. So, yeah, those dates that are important, 1719, 1764, and the 1770s. The earliest recording of Black people in the St. Louis area was 1719, when they were brought here by the French explorer and entrepreneur, Philippe Renaud. Renaud, during the reign of Louis XV, set out for Upper Louisiana in what was at that time French North America. He had a particular interest in the development of lead mining, and so he brought enslaved Africans, numbering about 500, who came from the island of Santo Domingo, the French colony of Haiti, to work in lead mines west of St. Genevieve, Missouri. Both the enslaved Africans and their slaveholders spoke French and were, at the very least, nominal Catholics. Next slide, please. So, to bring the story to life for you a little bit, I want to focus on the story of one Black Catholic family whose history in the St. Louis area can be traced from before the Civil War to our current era. This is the family of Ella Madden Lancaster, whose family was Catholic for generations. Now, Ella's shown on the slide with her husband, Oscar, and her daughter, Mary Elizabeth, who became an Oblate Sister of Providence. I've chosen to highlight this family story because I had the honor of helping to do a bit of research about the family, and also because, by virtue of a bit of serendipity, I have a personal tie to this family. Next slide. There. Ella's maternal grandmother, Mary Roberson, which you can see there on that slide, and her great-grandmother, Ella, on the very top tier of the slide, had been enslaved by a French property holder in St. Genevieve. There they were taught catechism by this French slaveholding family, and they learned all their prayers in French. When Mary became Catholic, when she was baptized, the family granted her her freedom. So now as a free Black woman, Mary eventually came to St. Louis, found work as a cook with a wealthy French family there, the Lucas family, and became one of a number of free Black people living in St. Louis before the Civil War. Next slide. The city of St. Louis was named for Louis IX, King of France, by the explorer Pierre Laclede, who founded the settlement in 1764. And one of the first 3 deeded tracts in this new settlement was a tumble-down log cabin, a house of worship that would eventually become the old cathedral, and which was until 1816 the only church of any denomination in the city. Now, because France and Spain, the colonial powers that alternately laid claim to the territory west of the Mississippi, were Catholic nations, one might say St. Louis was destined to have a large Catholic population. And from its very beginning, St. Louis was inhabited by Black people who were Catholic. Some were free, such as Mary Roberson, whom I just mentioned, and some were brought to St. Louis, having been enslaved by the city's original settlers. Church records dating back to the 1770s show that early on, neither racial, economic, or social barriers separated worshiping Catholics from one another. From 1776 to 1788, St. Louis's first pastor, Father Bernard de Lempac, baptized 410 white people, 106 Black people, and 92 Native Americans. The Jesuit historian, Father William Faherty, has written that, and I'll quote him, "The Blacks participated in much of the parish life. During the colonial days, the pioneers were far too busy providing for the essentials of life, for themselves and for their families, to be color conscious. They battled the elements and welcomed every hand. Together they worked, played, and prayed. At the time of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, between 1/4 and 1/3 of the 1,000 or so inhabitants of St. Louis were Black, and all were Catholic." Next slide. So there were a few important factors that changed that picture and ultimately led to a pattern of racial separation and exclusion of Blacks from most Catholic parishes. One was the movement of Anglo settlers westward into Missouri from the upper tier of southern slaveholding states. Slavery as practiced by these newcomers tended to be more harsh. Of course, this is all relative, but more harsh than under either the French or the Spanish, whose slave codes, at least nominally, granted some legal protections to slaves, imposed less rigid racial hierarchies, and often required religious instruction and baptism of enslaved people. A second factor was Missouri's entrance into the Union as a slave state in 1821, with a state constitution that codified racist sentiment and penalized such actions, as educating African Americans. So for example, by 1847, the education of blacks, free or enslaved, was prohibited in Missouri on penalty of fine and or imprisonment. A third factor was the influx, especially in the mid-19th century, of European immigrants, especially of German and Irish descent, who wanted religious services to be offered in their native languages and in a manner that preserved their cultural heritage and traditions. So here's an example of the kind of growth that occurred of the immigrant population in that period. In 1843, Bishop Peter Kenrick of St. Louis petitioned the Leopoldine Society in Vienna for financial assistance in building a Catholic church, St. Mary's of Victories, which still stands at 3rd and Gratiot. And that church was going to be built for German-speaking Catholics who were concentrated in that area. At the time he sent the appeal, there were about 6,000 German Catholics living in St. Louis. By 1860, just a little more than 15 years later, there were 60,000 German immigrants, most of whom were Catholic, living in St. Louis. So that gives you a sense of just the influx of folks into the St. Louis area. Thus, under Archbishop Kenrick and later Cardinal Glennon, a patchwork of ethnic and national churches developed that grew to become the Archdiocese of St. Louis. St. Francis Xavier, which is my parish, was originally at 9th and Lucas downtown. Remember, Lucas is the name of the family that Mary Roberson went to work for. And St. Francis Xavier was the first English-speaking parish in the city. It was built to serve the growing Irish population. So too did St. Patrick, St. Bridget of Erin, St. Malachy, St. Lawrence O'Toole. While St. Mary of Victories, St. Boniface, St. Joseph, Most Holy Trinity served German-speaking Catholics. St. Bonaventure was founded as an Italian national church. St. John Nepomuk served Bohemian Catholics, while St. Casimir and St. Stanislaus were predominantly Polish. Gradually, with the imposition of parish boundaries and increasingly segregated housing patterns, there were few Catholic churches in St. Louis where African Americans felt comfortable practicing their faith. There were a few exceptions. One was Saints Mary and Joseph in the Carondelet neighborhood, and St. Vincent de Paul in the Frenchtown area, just south of downtown. Next slide, please. So checking in with Ella's family, we find that her grandmother, Mary Roberson, met and married a man, James Alexander Madden, who worked as a drayman or carter. We don't have folks in those occupations now. But that was a person who with a wagon and horses makes a living by transporting goods. James Madden's freedom was obtained via a $500 bond. And there's not information about how he acquired that money, probably just saved it over years and years of work. But the bond was secured by John Fletcher Darby, who in 1835 became the 4th mayor of the city of St. Louis. Mary and James had 2 children, Charles Joseph Madden and Ella Teresa Madden, the aunt after whom our Ella that we saw earlier in the photograph was named. John Darby is an example of the folks who were moving into St. Louis, into the St. Louis area. He was born in North Carolina, then he moved with his father to Missouri to work on a farm in 1818, relocated to Kentucky in 1825, and then afterwards returned to Missouri, went to law school, became the mayor, and later a congressional representative for the state of Missouri. Next slide, please. In 1836, Bishop Joseph Rosati, who was the first bishop of the Diocese of St. Louis, gave the Jesuits permission to found a parish in conjunction with St. Louis College which they had acquired in 1829 and chartered in 1832 as St. Louis University. Although the parish congregation met for several years in the student chapel, it was evident from the beginning that they were going to need a church building. So plans for that building were begun, and on April the 12th, 1840, the cornerstone of the new church was laid by Bishop Rosati, situated at 9th and Lucas Avenue, and opened for use on Palm Sunday in 1843. So that's a picture of the original college church in that slide. I'm going to be talking a lot about the Jesuits because at one point they were given charge of the entire Black Catholic population in St. Louis. And I was thinking recently about what did that mean? So every baptism, every marriage, every funeral, every aspect of our religious practice, they had charge of that for all Black Catholics in the area. And although I'm going to be talking about the Jesuits pretty much, I do want to acknowledge along the way the contributions of other religious orders who served the Black community. So some early courageous efforts included, in 1845, the Sisters of St. Joseph opened a school for African American girls. That met with insurmountable resistance in the St. Louis community. A group of white men stormed the convent, and they were required to close that school. 1856, the school was operated by the Sisters of Mercy, and it met a similar fate. In 1858, Father Peter Koenig was the first St. Louis Jesuit to be assigned to minister to Black Catholics in the city, and he secured the uppermost gallery of the college church as a worship space for Black Catholics. By 1860, as the Civil War approached, more free than enslaved Black people lived in St. Louis. A number of them had become financially well established, and a significant portion of those folks were Catholic. Next slide, please. By 1872, the number of Black Catholics worshiping at the college church had outgrown that space. So under the leadership of Father Ignatius Pankin, who had by then assumed their spiritual care, the community, with proceeds from a Christmas fair, was able to purchase the old Vinegar Hill Hall at 14th and Gay downtown, which had housed a Baptist congregation, afterward a Presbyterian congregation, and it began a new life then as St. Elizabeth of Hungary Parish, the citywide African American Catholic Church. In allowing the formation of St. Elizabeth's, Archbishop Kenrick did not exclude Blacks from other parishes, but he did insist, and I'll quote, that it should be carefully published that the church is exclusively for the colored people and sacraments will not be administered to whites. Kenrick regarded St. Elizabeth's in much the same way as he did the national and ethnic churches in St. Louis. It was the church for African American Catholics. And as a result of that designation, African Americans became increasingly separated from the rest of the St. Louis Catholic population. But despite that separation, the St. Louis Black Catholic population was a tremendously resilient and faithful people, evidenced by the vitality of St. Elizabeth's Parish. By 1889, its parishioners began participating in 5 successive national Negro Catholic conferences organized by another prominent Black Catholic figure, Daniel Rudd. Lincoln Valley, who was editor of the St. Louis Advance, was elected vice president of that National Assembly of Black Catholics. Next slide, please. So Mary Roberson Madden and James Alexander Madden's children, Charles and Ella, would eventually become members of St. Elizabeth's Parish. Before the founding of St. Elizabeth's, they, like all Black Catholics, had attended the college church. They were married there, had family funerals there, had the children baptized there. But with the founding of St. Elizabeth's, they became active members of that parish. Charles Madden was an altar boy for Father Pankin, and he would sit with Father Pankin to read the lives of the saints. Charles wanted to pursue a call to the religious life, but he was unsuccessful in part because there was no seminary in the United States at that time that would accept black men. For a time, Charles moved away from St. Louis and lived in Savannah, Georgia. And there he met the woman that he would marry, Mary Louise LaRose, whose family had been Catholic for 2 generations. Together, he and Mary Louise had a large family, which included 1 daughter, named after Charles's sister, Ella Teresa Madden. In 1912, Charles and his family left Savannah and returned to his hometown of St. Louis. Next slide, please. By 1913, St. Elizabeth's under Father John McGuire moved from its original site to what had been an old family mansion at 2721 Pine Street. The house had belonged to the Walsh family, whose son had entered the priesthood and for whom a chapel had been added to that house. So the site was large enough for them to have a church, a school, and a community center there. And St. Elizabeth's had a tremendous number of parish organizations and activities, particularly during the 20s and 30s under the leadership of Father William Marcoux, who became the pastor in 1927. These are a few of the activities undertaken by parishioners at St. Elizabeth's. They published the St. Elizabeth's Chronicle, which grew into a nationally recognized interracial review. They inaugurated closed retreats for women and men. They presented an annual musical comedy, many of which were written and or produced by Father Daniel Lord, who is also a very well-known figure, a Jesuit, who had just a fascinating history. St. Elizabeth's was host in 1931 to the largest and most successful convention of Black Catholics in the history of the United States. They established a Council of the Knights of Peter Claver in St. Louis. They sponsored a weekly radio broadcast on station WEW, the Interracial Hour. They sent 2 young women and 1 young man into the religious life. They assisted with the opening of St. Mary's Infirmary. I'll tell you more about that in just a little bit. And then they instructed, baptized, and confirmed thousands of souls. Next slide, please. So Ella Madden, the daughter of Mary and Charles, Ella there on the right, was 20 years old when her family moved to St. Louis. She went to Sumner High School, where she met her future husband, Oscar Lee Lancaster, Jr. She trained briefly to be a teacher, and she taught school until 1922, when she and Oscar were married. He had converted to Catholicism and had been baptized at St. Elizabeth's the year before they were married. And Ella said she was absolutely not interested in Oscar at all until he had converted to Catholicism. Ella and Oscar had 5 children: Oscar Lee Lancaster III, Mary Elizabeth, Charles, Christine, and Benjamin, all of whom were baptized at St. Elizabeth's. The family members were active in so many of the parish activities. Ella was a catechist. She wrote for St. Elizabeth's Chronicle, and she was a member of the Ladies' Sodality. Oscar was a member of the parish men's club. The children were involved with sports and musical activities. And Ella and Oscar helped to found St. Joseph's High School, the Catholic secondary school for African Americans, which opened in 1937 and which all of their children attended. But Ella was aware of discrimination her family faced when venturing beyond St. Elizabeth's. She recounted her son's experience when he went to confession at another parish, which was on his way home from work. She said, he would work on Saturdays. Then Charles said he could go to confession at St. Matthew's on his way home and to Holy Communion at St. Elizabeth's in the morning. So he went to confession, and this priest heard his confession, but told him, "Don't come back here to confession anymore. Go to your own church." When he came home, he wouldn't go to Holy Communion the next day because he was mad. I had to talk to that child and tell him that priest was a human being, like the rest of us are human. He can sin, and he'll have to go to confession about that because that was wrong. This kind of experience was validated by another member of St. Elizabeth's, Adrian Johnson, an organist at several St. Louis Catholic churches who remembered the racial discrimination he experienced at Mass. He said, "Right here in St. Louis, the good Father Collins, who was pastor of Visitation, didn't want blacks to come into his church to attend Mass. He didn't care if you had a soul or not. You weren't going to be saved by him. Visitation, St. Matthew's, St. Mark. Well, I never went to St. Rose in those days, but the other churches like that, they had segregated sections, the last 2 or 3, maybe 4 pews. And those were the only places you could sit in those churches. You would go to communion after everybody else if you wanted to, which was a good thing for your humility if you wanted to practice it. I would walk down to St. Elizabeth's rather than go through that treatment." Next slide, please. So we can't talk about St. Elizabeth's without spending a little more time talking about Father William Marcoux. He was a remarkable man and somewhat controversial, but he was a determined man of action. From his time at St. Stanislaus Seminary in Florissant, where he began his formation as a Jesuit, he had, along with a few of his fellow seminarians, including his brother John, dedicated his life to serving African Americans. His family had come from Minnesota, and they had acquired wealth generations back from land that they owned in the Caribbean and from the labor of enslaved people there. A fact which I believe haunted Marcoux and caused him to feel a sense of indebtedness. He was passionate about repaying that debt, and some would say rash. When he came to St. Louis University to begin his studies, he was warned, "Do not cross Grand Avenue. It's dangerous." East of Grand is where the Mill Creek Valley neighborhood was located, home to a large concentration of the Black community. Of course, that is exactly where Marcoux went, meeting and getting to know the residents and evangelizing the people there. He was patriarchal. After he became pastor at St. Elizabeth's, he would go into meetings of white Catholics in St. Louis and say, "I'm here to tell you about the Black man's perspective." Presumptuous, but he was well-intentioned, a man with a good heart, who with his brother is remembered with deep affection by many Black Catholics in St. Louis. Father Marcoux actually spent his last days at Marquette, my alma mater, and we were actually there at the same time, though I didn't know him. I know we would have disagreed on some issues. He supported the war in Vietnam, and I was taking part in sit-ins at the St. Joan of Arc Chapel opposing the war. But I would love to have met him. He was a remarkable man. Next slide. So I've mentioned the role of the Jesuits in spiritually caring for the Black Catholic community, but I also want to recognize many other religious orders who addressed both the spiritual and material needs of African American Catholics. So we mentioned earlier that Mother Catherine Drexel had founded the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament. Those sisters opened a mission in 1914 next to St. Elizabeth's, and in 1916 began a 2-room school in St. Elizabeth's Rectory for 125 children. They also taught at St. Nicholas School here, having been invited to St. Louis in a letter from Father Marcoux. Actually, he was yet in formation. He had not yet been ordained. But he wrote to Mother Catherine Drexel. St. Nicholas was founded in 1866, but gradually its white Catholic population moved west, and its complex, which included a school, fell into disuse. So the school then became a warehouse until Marku asked permission to return it to its former use as a school and asked the Blessed Sacrament sisters to come and teach there. And they were, a couple of sisters came and helped to get the building into reasonable shape. They were pretty dismayed by the appearance of it, but they got it into reasonable shape. And they were expecting just a few children to show up to enroll. When the school opened its doors in 1924, 500 children were there to register. Later, the Most Precious Blood sisters took over operation of the school. The Servants of the Divine Word took charge of St. Nicholas Parish in 1926, after which the church served as a mission for the downtown district and evangelized the African American population, which meanwhile had moved into that neighborhood. Then there were Helpers of the Holy Souls. They taught catechism to public school children, taught sewing classes at St. Benedict's Center, which was kind of in the Midtown area, at the Sacred Heart Center, which was North Side. They taught home economics to moms. They supervised scouting and recreational activities for children, including a drum and bugle corps. And they visited the sick. A sister, Flora Sappert, was a prominent member of that order, and her name would be recognized by many older Black Catholics in St. Louis. The Daughters of Charity taught at St. Malachy School after that parish was placed in charge of the Jesuits in 1941. St. Malachy's also became a thriving parish with a variety of men's clubs and ladies' clubs, also a parish credit union and a retail commodities cooperative. Next slide, please. There were the Oblate Sisters of Providence, founded in 1829 in Baltimore by Mother Mary Elizabeth Lang. And that was an order of is an order of African American religious women. They operated here in St. Louis a school for girls, St. Rita Academy, as well as St. Francis Orphanage and 2 other mission schools. And they too conducted lessons in sewing and cooking. They taught catechism. They attended to the social welfare of African Americans. The Sisters of St. Joseph, they opened St. Joseph High School in 1937. And at the height of its operation, there were about 170 children enrolled there. Many Black St. Louisans remember Father Patrick Malloy at that school, the school's athletic director, under whom the school's teams competed in integrated football and basketball games. Then there were the Sisters of St. Mary, and they began to provide inpatient and outpatient care to African Americans at St. Mary's Infirmary in 1933. St. Mary's Infirmary was actually just raised last year, I believe it was, yes. It sat vacant for a while and fell into disrepair and was finally raised, but it served the community for many, many years. And often when you hear about healthcare in St. Louis and healthcare for African Americans in St. Louis, people mention immediately Homer G. Phillips Hospital. Homer G. Phillips was a gem of a hospital, state-of-the-art facility, important site for training Black physicians and healthcare workers from around the country. But before Homer G. was open, St. Mary's Infirmary was serving African American inpatients in St. Louis. Before the infirmary opened and offered that service, there were really virtually no other facilities that served African American inpatients. The couple that existed were terribly under-resourced, poorly staffed, overcrowded. They were inadequate in every respect. So this was a major development when the infirmary opened. The Sisters of St. Mary also founded a school of nursing for Black women to staff the infirmary. And they founded a novitiate for African American women in 1946 that Sister Mary Antona Ebo entered. And this was also really important because at that time, Most religious orders were not accepting African American women. Next slide, please. In addition to the institutions serving African Americans in St. Louis City, there were missions in and around the area. St. Peter Claver Mission got its start in 1916. Seminarians from St. Stanislaus catechized the people living in the community of Anglum, which became Robertson, that's in North County. Blessed Martin de Porres Mission, located in Meacham Park, the African American community in Kirkwood, so in West County. And their children received catechism classes, and there were social activities in a recreation center next to the church. Holy Guardian Angels Mission, that was in Kinloch, started by Jesuit Father Arnold Garvey in 1926, and afterwards administered by Father Otto Mormon. It consisted of a church, a rectory, a school run by the Oblate Sisters of Providence, also a parish hall, a medical center, a retreat house for men. So this is just to give you a sense. Also, there was St. Clement's Mission, and that was actually in the city, the Midtown area, consisting of a chapel and a school founded in 1941 by the Redemptorists who were at St. Alphonsus Rock. This is just to give you a sense of the pockets of activity in the city and around the county. And actually, of late, we've been discovering a few more such concentrations of activity. Next slide, please. So there were some additional turning points in Black Catholic history. One was the year 1944, the integration of St. Louis University. That began with a call to Father John Marcoux, William's brother, who was at St. Malachy's. A woman, Maddie Williams, whose daughter had attended St. Elizabeth's, had gone away to high school but wanted to attend a Catholic university. Marcoux contacted the president of the university and later attended a meeting of the school's faculty and administrators who opposed the young woman's admission. Marcoux spoke in favor of her admission and meanwhile had been visiting with the city editor of the Post-Dispatch, who had been challenging racial discrimination at the University of Missouri. At the same time, Father Claude Heighthouse, who's pictured there on the right, a professor of art and archaeology and director of publications at SLU, became aware of the university's position on the admission of Black students and made integration the subject of an explosive homily at a student mass in February of 1944, at which he made an impassioned plea for students to rid themselves of racial prejudice. Heighthouse also distributed his sermon to the university student newspaper and to the Post. And though he and Marcoux were both censured and reassigned, together they were responsible for the admission of 5 African American students during the summer of 1944. In 1946, we had the arrival of Archbishop Joseph Ritter, and he's shown there next to Father Claude Heighthouse, who in 1947, this is years now before Brown v. Board of Education, desegregated Catholic schools and said Black Catholics will go to their parish churches. There would be no segregated Catholic schools or churches in St. Louis, a decision that led to the eventual closing of St. Joseph High School and St. Elizabeth's in 1950. Ritter built Cardinal Glennon Hospital to serve all children, regardless of a race, and in 1955 he desegregated all Catholic hospitals. Father John Shockley, Monsignor Shockley, who's shown on the left there, would be appointed pastor at St. Bridget's in 1961. St. Bridget's was located right next to the Pruitt-Igoe public housing complex, which came to be the poster child for all that could go wrong in public housing. But at the time, he brought an army of volunteers to the area around Pruitt-Igoe to evangelize that neighborhood and to provide social service to the community. Archbishop Ritter, said by some to be the foremost prelate in the United States during the 20th century on matters of race, would go on to form the Archdiocesan Commission on Human Rights in 1963. He would approve the participation by St. Louis Catholic clergy, religious, and laity in the civil rights marches in Selma in 1965. And St. Louis sent one of the largest delegations to Selma under the supervision of Archbishop Ritter. And that, of course, is one in which Sister Mary Antona Ebo became a very visible representation of the church. Finally, in 1970, the Archdiocese had its first African-American priest, Father Henry Harrison. Just a bit of context here. Nationally, in the 60s and the 70s, we would see the development of a Black Catholic movement in the United States that called for the denunciation of racism within the church and also for self-determination within the institutional church. That movement would be led by Black Catholic clergy, religious, and lay people in organizations that continue to function today. So as the Black population in St. Louis expanded north and west, parishes that had once been all white became predominantly African American, and there's a host of such parishes in St. Louis: St. Bridget, St. Matthew's, St. Leo's, St. Teresa's, Sacred Heart, St. Anne, Holy Rosary, many, many, many more. And now a concern is with closure and merging of some of those parishes. And what will the presence of the church be in North City and North County? The next slide, please. There's one final chapter in the story of the Madden Lancaster family. Ella and Oscar's oldest son, Oscar Lee III, was encouraged by Father William Marcoux to enter the military, and from there he was able to attend Loyola University in Chicago to pursue an accounting degree. That person, Oscar, became a friend of my family for many years as I was growing up in Chicago. Over time, we grew apart, we lost contact. I was aware that he passed in 1979. But after I moved to St. Louis, I thought I'd try to find his sister, Mary Elizabeth, whom I knew had become an Oblate Sister of Providence. So as I was searching for Mary Elizabeth, I was going about my normal work and extracurricular activity, a big portion of which has always involved music. I sing in the Archdiocesan choir and in my parish choir, sometimes at the Carmelite Monastery. And one day, listening to my car radio, I heard this wonderful music of Advent. The announcer said that the CD, Advent at Ephesus, had been recorded by a religious community, the Benedictines of Mary at Ephesus, and that the CD had topped the sacred music chart that year. So I ordered the CD, and inside there were liner notes and pictures of members of the order. Strikingly, in some of the pictures, was one diminutive Black nun. And I have to admit, the first question that came to mind when I saw her, because the Benedictines of Ephesus are located in Gower, Missouri, which is kind of in the Kansas City metropolitan area, but is also kind of really out in the boondocks. So when I saw her there, I thought, what in the heck is she doing there? At any rate, I continued looking for Mary Elizabeth. And as Sister Antona would say, in God's providence, I stumbled on a lengthy description of Mary Elizabeth on the internet. It described her life as a teacher and an archivist for the Oblates of Providence, and then noted that after many years, she sought a more contemplative life. Finally, after 50 years, she made the difficult decision to leave the Oblates of Providence. And with the assistance of the Bishop of the Diocese of Scranton, she founded a new order located in Gower, Missouri, the Benedictines of Ephesus. She was the little black nun whose picture was included with the CD liner notes. She had taken the religious name Sister Mary Wilhelmina, a feminine form of William, in honor of Father William Marcoux. Unfortunately, she passed before I was able to meet her. But having helped with research on a book about her life, and then having an opportunity to meet some of her family here in St. Louis at a previous Black Catholic History Month presentation, this sort of brought things full circle for me. Next slide, please. So to summarize, African American Catholics were in St. Louis since before its founding. Throughout a significant portion of that history, the Catholic Church in St. Louis neglected multiple opportunities for evangelization, remained silent when it should have spoken out, for example, during the Civil War, condoned the displacement of the Black community by consenting to so-called urban renewal projects such as that involving Mill Creek, or actively engaged in racial discrimination. Nevertheless, the African American Catholic community, supported and served by some dedicated clergy and committed religious, remains strong, active, and faithful to this day. And here you see celebrations of Catholic liturgy that include aspects of African American culture, rich, colorful garb, African cloth on the altar, included without changing any of the rubrics of the Mass. These are among the gifts Black Catholics bring to the church. And there on that slide at the bottom, you see the Gi Nyami symbol, ubiquitous in Ghana. It literally means except for God. And I was a little confused when I heard that translation. I thought, what does that mean? No one has seen the beginning of the world, nor will anyone see the end of it, except for God. It represents the omnipotence, the omnipresence, and omniscience of God. And it encapsulates the faith of African people who see the involvement of God in every aspect of human life. Last slide, please. So here are a few of the resources that I used in preparing this presentation. There are a couple I'd like to call to your attention if you're wanting to extend your exploration of Black Catholicism. Michael mentioned earlier the document What We Have Seen and Heard, the 1984 pastoral letter written by 10 Black Catholic bishops. And then more recently, Open Wide Our Hearts. That is the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops document issued in 2018 in the wake of Charlottesville that addresses racism in the church. So I thank you again for being here this evening, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. It's a lot to take in. We've covered centuries of history. Yes.
So we spoke quite a bit about the coming of ethnic parishes into the St. Louis region, and I know that they still exist, at least historically still associated as German parishes or things like that. Do you still think that African American Catholics and Black Catholics still feel a bit of tension in these spaces?
I think that's true. And, you know, I rely on many anecdotes I've heard as people have described visiting other parishes in St. Louis. Even though we're no longer restricted by parish boundaries, I think that there still is the experience among African Americans, you know, when we walk into a parish, where we're not a member. Folks just looking and saying, sometimes saying, you know, what are you, not saying, but communicating, what are you doing here? You know, there was pre-COVID, there was a listening session in St. Louis for American bishops. And there were several, I was able to take part in that. And there were several African American Catholics who were there. And some of the experiences they described were wrenching. I've not had those experiences, but I've certainly had, because when I don't have a choir commitment in the summer, I like to go around and visit other parishes. And so I've certainly had the experience of folks just looking and kind of wondering, what are you doing here? Which is fine. It's not a deterrent for me, but yeah. And I recall at this listening session, one thing that really stayed with me, a young woman mentioned, and this is very recently, going up for communion, and the priest saying to her, what do you want? It was, you know, yeah. And so I loved her response, though. Her response to that was, she became a Eucharistic minister so that nobody else would have that experience. Yeah, no one else would have that experience. Yeah, any other questions? Yes.
So you talked about the merging of the churches. Is that going to be like a diocesan thing where like all the churches are going to be merging, or like mostly just the African ones?
Oh, so what I was referring to specifically were churches in the African American community. So churches on the north side, a lot of the parishes that I mentioned, you know, where there were just really gigantic complexes, the church, the school, the rectory, the convent, that are really terribly expensive to maintain. And so there were not, as there got to be the demographic shift, there were not enough people in the community to financially support that. And so then you got the merger of several parishes. And that has continued to happen. And yeah, some are apprehensive about what the future may hold there. But yeah, it's been a concern with schools as well, and school closings in North City and North County. And College Church is in the North City Deanery. So we have the great fortune of being close to those issues and being able to hear from people who are affected by those issues. Yeah. Yes?
Speaking of demographics, which way are the numbers trending in terms of numbers of Black Catholics over maybe the last 10 or 20 years?
You know, I don't really have that figure for St. Louis. I know that nationally there are about 3 million African American Catholics. So it's actually larger than some African American Protestant denominations, the AME Church, CME Church. So it's a sizable number. In St. Louis, I'm not really sure exactly the number of African American Catholics. But it's, you know, it's always a matter of keeping in the forefront, evangelizing to that community. Yes, yeah. I guess if I had to take a guess, I would say that the number has probably been decreasing. As a matter of fact, I think I've read that of late. And it is, it's related in part to that same phenomenon occurring among younger people. So maybe not choosing another denomination, but not actively practicing religion. Yes?
I'm just wondering if you could maybe comment on how the church in St. Louis today could better speak to the needs of African American Catholics, maybe than what it has been in recent history.
Mm-hmm. Well, first, I think we have to be aware of the history, you know, and we have to acknowledge the history. Right now, we have a couple of projects that are happening at College Church and among the Jesuits, and you probably heard about the Slavery, History, Memory, and Reconciliation Project. So I sometimes feel like there has to be almost a Truth and Reconciliation Committee so that we acknowledge the history and then understand how we all are part of systemic racism, and also how we all suffer. People who are not people of color suffer as a consequence of that. And then I think there's some very specific kinds of activities. We at College Church are undertaking a parish racial equity review. So we're looking at everything about our parish, our history, our organizational structure, all of that, and considering in what ways do our policies, practices, and procedures uphold systemic racism? How do we then dismantle it? And how do we rebuild and replace with something that is just? And so I think that is a process that has to be undergone by the entire archdiocese, but the church at large. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much.